Chapter 25, The Deal, from JE2US-A Novel. The state media network, characteristically, had made no mention of the tanks. Several other networks that had been covering the event live couldn't avoid the obvious. Even though all networks had ties to the government, and even though Bayal leaned on those networks to downplay the aggressive actions of the military, there was still leaking coverage that portrayed this action as excessive and unwarranted. However, over the past couple generations, the general populace had become morally brittle. Their capacity to feel had frosted over. In many ways, it really wasn't their fault. The systemic concrete had set before they were born, before their parents were born. It was the way things were, the way they had always been. People didn't hoist slavery onto the scales of justice to see if it tipped toward the unconscionable. It was what it was. But then Jesus came along. Consciences were resuscitated. Morally inactive lungs found oxygen. And even some found their scruples taking a first halting breath. The increase in awareness and empathy for the brotherhood was directly due to the presence and teachings of Jesus. The slaves knew it, the government knew it, President Chatsworth knew it. It was as if this Jesus was somehow awakening a sleeping twinge of caring for one's brother. This was not good news for a system built on prudence over benevolence, a regime calibrated to maintain the status quo. Up to this point, things had been mostly peaceful, but there was a wariness that at the twist of a knob, things might become unhinged. The pawns and the kings were on edge. When tanks became part of the story, you knew there were people in high places with tight sphincters. It was Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after the religious service had been punctuated with an explosive encore. Things had calmed. Slaves had gone back to work in order to eat. Hunger was a nagging provocateur of compliance. Since Saturday's widely publicized message of Jesus, complete with the river reversal, there was a new wave of followers slipping into his counter-current stream of thought. Many of these people were moving beyond curiosity cliques to devotees, disciples. Tens of thousands were now watching this Minneapolis Messiah and actually trying to live what he preached. Judas, however, was not one of them. He was still stuck in carpetbagger mode when he took his seat across the desk from Sebastian, the painting of Maddie hanging over his right shoulder, always, ever surveying the room. The fainting sofa in front of His Holiness seemed to fit Judas just right. He looked around Sebastian's office, a noble desk made of walnut, a bar fully stocked with bourbons predating his birth, a collection of rare Han Dynasty swords, a 15th century silver chalice overlaid with gold, and a French antique 5-arm chandelier of brass and crystals. Why do I not have an office like this? Thought the self-designated PR agent of Jesus. Sebastian now stood, reached for a 40-year-old bourbon behind his desk. He looked over his shoulder to Judas with a questioning nod. Judas returned the gesture, trying to coolly say, "Hell yes, I want a sip of something I'd have to work 2 weeks to pay for." The drinks were poured. As the glass was handed to Judas, Sebastian raised his glass and said, "To the plan." "The plan," responded Judas. It burned all the way down till it warmed his affirmation-thirsty ego. This was the second secretive meeting with Sebastian since the plane ride. Judas was becoming increasingly at home in the company of black robes and rubies. His confidence was budding in his ability to match wits with the likes of Sebastian. Judas was willing to compromise on peripheral items, but he had his non-negotiables. He was willing to barter that which he didn't own if it led to a greater return, a more fiscally beneficial end justifying means. Was he stealing? Judas preferred to think of it as abetting the card play of a reticent, inexperienced ingenue. It was for the best, the good of the cause, or so he rationalized. Of course, Judas held those cards close to his chest, convinced Sebastian was unaware of his intentions. The millions, hundreds of millions of dollars he intended to skim from the complicit hem of Sebastian's robe would fund the mission of this economically illiterate Messiah for years, maybe decades. Judas' reasoning went something like this. With celebrity comes marketability. With marketability comes opportunity. And when you stare opportunity in the face and don't recognize her for the drop-dead gorgeous woman she is, wearing a come-hither look in her eye, well, then you don't deserve the bitch, and she moves on. Jesus, to Judas' thinking, was draped in a form-fitting black dress, heaving with the cleavage of opportunity. If Judas had his way, he would be attending all the galas flush with fat-walleted dignitaries, and he would do it with Jesus on his arm. After all, Jesus was the media darling, the buzz of the nation, the hum at every bar, the whispers at every water cooler. He was the flavor on flat screens to a bored nation looking to spice up their bland lives. Judas' game plan was good, however, Sebastian knew this neophyte was going to be taking lessons from him. He pulled Judas from the fiddle case and played him with a freshly rosined bow, charming him unconsciously from the shadows of his intentions. Both Sebastian and Judas knew about the extensive stockpile of paintings that Jesus had brought to life. There was a year's worth of masterpieces just begging to be tagged with 7-digit asking prices. Brunel had tried to keep the loot under wraps from everyone, including Sebastian, but the dark-alleyed goons had ratted on him. Brunel, of course, claimed that he had been holding them in escrow for the future use of Baal, but he had had his own designs on them. Brunel had started out much like Sebastian and Judas, conniving how to monetize these properties, gaining the most benefit for himself. They had to be worth millions on the open market. However, over the course of the last few months, watching Jesus paint, often via the security cameras, he had begun to see Jesus differently. On several occasions, Jesus had invited Brunel in to watch. He had talked with him, asking him questions, getting to know him. Once, Jesus had said, "You know, these are real." Brunel had looked at him as if to say, "Real? Sure, real paintings, real art, real masterpieces." But he suspected Jesus meant more than that. Jesus continued, "These are all real people, living, thinking, questioning." He paused. Look closely. Can you see them breathe?" Then, "I love how they ask me questions, and I answer them with each brush stroke, showing them more of themselves and more of me, and bit by bit, they come alive." Brunel's eyebrows angled downward just a touch, grasping for understanding. They were lifelike, sure, but alive? Now Sebastian's eyes narrowed. He swirled the last swallow of bourbon around in his glass, then tipped it all the way up. Licking his lips, he said, "There's enough money here for the both of us, Judas." He smiled, revealing a sliver of polished teeth through his thin, pale lips. Then, As if defining the contract, he said, "I'll take 70%, you'll get 30. I'll manage all the sales and deposit the money in an offshore account for you." He smirked. "How you spend it is up to you." Sebastian refreshed the rosin on his bow. "Get yourself a penthouse, a yacht, a slave, and a girl. Take her on a 5-year vacation. Get as far away from that pretend Messiah as you can get." A yacht. Judas hadn't thought about a yacht. And the bow coaxed another melody from the ever-wandering, wanting heartstrings of Judas. "What about this painting?" asked Judas, turning to look at Maddie's portrait hanging above him. Judas stood and put one hand on each side of the painting, gently lifting it from the wall. Sebastian tried to hide his surprise at the ease with which Judas freed the painting from its tether. He had been unable to budge it. "I think this one should be mine." "No, that's my painting." Sebastian said it a bit too forcefully, almost scaring Judas. Backpedaling, he said, "Jesus gave that to me. I'm rather fond of it." Judas shrugged and was about to rehang it when Sebastian stopped him. "Just lean it against the wall. I have other plans for her." Other plans is exactly what he had, and not just for the Maddie painting, but for all of Jesus' works. The handshake that followed was cold and contractual, a covenant that, on the surface, sealed the sale of an esteemed art collection, but when the paint was chipped away, revealed a barter of souls. That night, after the city had gone to sleep, 4 black SUVs pulled into the alley behind Lieu d'Art. A crew of efficient hoods emptied the gallery of anything carrying Jesus moniker. Every brushstroke of the Minneapolis Messiah was now in the custody of one Sebastian Damien Gontrafo.